All right, here we go. We are live. Welcome, everybody, to the SFT Creation versus Evolution conversation. This is episode one of a new podcast series I will be hosting, where I discuss the creation versus evolution controversy with evolutionists, with those of differing opinions and views in regard to this topic. This is going to be a ton of fun. I'm looking forward to these important conversations. They are going to be more laid back, more free flowing, and organic. As any of our audience knows, critics and non critics alike, we host a lot of formal debates here. We've now hosted, I believe, 180 on all sorts of topics. So if you're a debate addict like myself, and many of those that follow us, you've got endless debates to enjoy. So again, these are going to be more informal, laid back, and free flowing. Tonight, I've got Ken Rock joining me for an important conversation. The Rock himself, I believe. So, Ken, thank you so much for joining us or myself for this conversation.
Hello, sorry, best not to call me The Rock. You might get a lawsuit for that one.
Hey, one day maybe we'll get The Rock himself on here. So, Ken, thanks for being here. This is going to be a good conversation. And before we get into it, though, I do want to thank everybody in the chat for being here. We want to make this interactive as well. So if you guys do have questions, let's say for myself or Ken, although I'll be engaging Ken in a discussion, I'm also the host here. So I will be looking at the chat and I will be taking questions, and we'll do our best to interact with you. So let me go over a couple announcements first before the fun begins. Speaking of Ken Rock is going to be here on Wednesday. This debate is going to be an hour earlier than usual. This one will be at 7 p.m. EST. 6 p.m. Central. So Ken Rock and Dr. Dino Evolution is on trial. This is going to be the sequel. And I'm looking forward to this one, Ken. And so we can consider this a pre-show to the debate itself. Then 2 days later, Rune Norderhog and Kent. Rune's going to be taking the Evolution Debate Challenge. That's going to be a lot of fun. I've been chatting with Rune. He's all ready to go, and that'll be one to remember. I just scheduled this one. This is going to be a big one. Nick from the Planner Walk channel. Check that out. Once I set the event itself, I'll have it linked. So he's got a fairly popular channel where he critiques young Earth creation and anti-evolutionists, things like that, flat earthers. So he's going to be taking on Kent. I believe that's going to be June 14th. So as soon as this conversation is over, I've got about 4 or 5 new events all confirmed that I will be scheduling and putting up on the channel for you guys. And last thing I want to mention, the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook. For 2 or 3 days there, it was it's a blessing. All the glory to God. It was overwhelming. It was awesome to see that so many people are passionate on this important topic. As for 2 or 3 days there, we were number one in terms of new releases. So that's awesome. And the feedback has been good. A couple critics have certainly spoken up, and I will be responding to those in due time. So definitely looking forward to the ongoing conversation that this book leads to or results in. So available now, Amazon. You can get the color edition or the black and white edition as well. So that being said, let's get right into the conversation again. Ken, thanks for being here. This is your second time here. You debated Kent. Since Wednesday's the sequel, that means if there's a sequel, there's a part 1. So there is a part 1 on the channel. I'll link it in the description box for people to see. It was a good debate. It was a lot of fun, one to remember. So, Ken, before we really get into the meat of this discussion, tell the audience a little bit about who you are, a little bit about let's say why you find this topic important. And also, I know you got a channel, so a little bit about your channel as well.
Hello, yeah, I do run a channel. I run the Kin Rock channel, obviously. Usually the topic I generally go over is stuff like first debates, power debating, annualizing stories, what would happen under circumstances. Usually the more nerdy stuff. And why I think that's an important conversation. I mean, realistically, if people are going to have a conversation, by default, it's kind of important because conversations are how information's given. It's an exchange of those ideas and all that. So that's why I think it's important, because if without it, where are we?
And
I also, sorry, you can.
No, I was just going to say, where exactly can people find you? I do have your link in the description box, but it is Ken Rock, right? Your channel?
Yeah, it's Ken Rock. Ken space Rock, like it shows on the screen.
Yeah.
You'll see a picture of a person with a rock head with a YouTube label behind it. I post it somewhere, but.
And I know the first thing that jumped out for me is back when I was a kid, one of my favorite shows was Dragon Ball Z. So I grew up with that show, and I noticed you had some videos and visuals, Dragon Ball Z style. So I thought that was pretty cool. One thing we have in common. Is that something you still enjoy, Ken?
Oh yeah, I recently just started watching all of GT, because one of the big conversations that's going on in the Dragon Ball sphere right now is GT versus Super.
Right. Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball GT, Dragon Ball Super never ends, right? I'm a bit of a nerd, but no, that's cool. And again, if anybody wants to check out Ken's channel, it is in the description box. So we can consider this. Yeah, we can consider this. Goku versus Brawly, and whoever's Goku and whoever's Brawly, we can leave up to the audience. So that being said, Ken, thank you for that introduction. So my first question, I guess, to kind of kick us off in this discussion is, you're an evolutionist, as in you hold to common ancestry, common descent. From my understanding, you are a theistic evolutionist. And why don't you tell us what you believe first pertaining to the origins issue, creation versus evolution?
See, I don't really know if it's a creation versus evolution issue, because you can have both positions be true. It's kind of how a higher being like God will be able to exist. So realistically, anything he does and anything that we would find scientifically wouldn't necessarily have to argue, because it would be above our heads. So he could make the universe the way it is and all that, and set it up in such a way that it would be as old as it needs to be, and have whatever processes need to already happen as if it had happened in a vacuum, separately from the reality that we find ourselves in.
So would you say? So would you say, Ken, that God, if you're a theistic evolutionist, would you say that God employed the process of evolution to bring about man, essentially?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Like, would you say that from your position, theistic evolution, would you say that God used the process of evolution, natural selection, mutation, so on and so forth, to eventually bring about man? Like, this is the process God used. Is that your position?
Yeah, and I think it would make sense as well, because it would also allow, like, if something were to go wrong later down, he could kind of like, as a lot of people who believe against or go against evolution, you got your program and all that. But if you set it in such a way that you can edit that program and you have it set up so that it can, then that would just make sense, because in any fault that happens at some point in time, you can fix it, kind of like an update. And that's what I think evolution was meant to be.
And so when it comes to evolutionary theory, or when it comes to common descent, sometimes I find that there's a conflation. So I guess by evolution, by the word evolution, especially for the audience sake, what do you mean by that? What would be your definition of evolution exactly?
See, that's the interesting thing. So we have to kind of what's the word I'm looking for? We'd have to look at the word a little bit more zoomed in, because evolution on itself just means the change of something over time. Like, you could go right now and Google the word, the evolution of cars, and you'll actually see a progressive timeline of how cars change and all that. Do the same thing with phones, TV shows, anything. So when the topic that we're really more on is more biological evolution, the changing of life over time, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay. So evolution in general, the word can mean change over time. And as you pointed out, even cars can change over time through man's input, of course. The vehicles are designed. Biological evolution, then change over time, change in allele frequencies in populations over time or over generations. So that being said, by evolution, Ken, we would certainly agree. Right. If you meant a change in allele frequencies in populations over generations, then we would agree with that. Change over time is real. We see change. But do you believe that type of change means that all life, including plants and animals, are related? Like, would you hold to the position of common descent that not only says we see change, but that all life is related? Plants, animals, humans, chimpanzees, dogs, fish, so on and so forth.
By would I hold to it, do you mean like would something I would fight with, or do you mean like it's something that I believe in currently?
Right. Is that something you believe in, that by change, by evolution, you believe not only dogs and wolves are related, but dogs, wolves, and let's say, plants of various kinds?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument that could be made for it, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. That's perfect. And that's a perfect way for us to, lead into the next portion of this discussion. And you've got a debate coming up with Kent, evolution on trial. So we both agree in change over time. We both believe in change in allele frequencies and populations over time. We would agree with that. We would both be sitting here arguing against a fixity of species view, right? That's very easy to demolish. But the question is, I guess, that I would have for you, what would be the most, and I understand that it's typically a data set when it comes to common ancestry, right? But why don't we start with one convincing line of evidence for that type of evolution that says, dogs, wolves, and banana plants are related, not just dogs and wolves? What would be a convincing line of evidence for you when it comes to that kind of evolution?
For me, as of this moment, because I don't really have a data set, I've told you multiple times, this isn't a subject that I generally have dived into as much, and I'm not ashamed to admit that right here, just because I wanted to be honest with everyone else. But for me, there's no reason to say that there's a limit to what an animal could or couldn't become, what a cell could or couldn't become. Because if we both agree that change has happened, you'd have to say that it couldn't happen, to say that a cell couldn't become a plant and an animal like a wolf, you'd have to automatically put a limit into what it could become. And I've never seen any limit that's ever been explained outside of, just everything just becomes its own kind.
Okay, so a convincing line of evidence to you is this type of change, right, that we're talking about here, this microevolutionary variation where we get a change in the frequency of the expression of different traits, that I would say is not really disputed. You would say enough of these kinds of micro changes can lead to large scale evolution, single celled like ancestors into whales and humans and chimpanzees over time, of course. So you would say a good line of evidence is that these changes can accumulate enough to explain the biodiversity of life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I was trying to, because I talk to Kent every once in a while. It's something I've been trying to explain to him. Let's take the mud skipper, my favorite animal for some reason. If you gave it stronger leg, thin little flippers, it could theoretically get onto land better and could grow to become more of a land mammal, get stronger lungs, get drier skin. These are things that it could get. Or you can go the opposite direction and give it still stronger flippers, but make it so that it can breathe in more water, get in the oxygen that it needs, make it a little bit bigger depending on where the water is, and then it become more fish. And if it happens at the same time, now you have two branching paths. You have a land version and a water version. If they go down that line long enough, they're going to become two different animals. And we're going to find ourselves in this position where we would just say that we're never related at all, but their starting part at that point would be the mud skipper. And it is more imaginary, but it's not far out there.
So, and I appreciate that response. So with what you just said, right, we have a mud skipper today. And so with enough change, and what we should talk about is what what results in this kind of change, right? Because again, we both agree that there is change, this microevolutionary variation that we see. Evolutionary theory would purport, for the most part, you have mutations as the source for all novel genetic variation that natural selection can act upon, right? It's natural selection that's the fine-tuning mechanism. It's not necessarily a creative force, but mutations add the necessary genetic diversity or variation that selection can now act upon. So typically what I like to say is, don't give me a story or something I have to imagine, or don't give me a historical reconstruction, let's say, in regard to the fossil record. Show me how this can happen. And if you can't show me how it can happen, then don't tell me that it did happen through storytelling. And I'm not accusing you of storytelling or anything like that. I'm just saying that typically what I do find is historical reconstructions based on a series of fossils found in the geological record. Or, hey, let's look at this animal today, right? And, we could imagine thousands to millions of years into the future with enough of these changes and divergence events, we can get, X, Y, Z. So I guess my question would be, what's your overall view on the sources of this type of change, mutations and in natural selection? Do you think that those are enough to drive your fish to fisherman or your single-celled like ancestor into a whale over time?
Well, and this is something that you end up with in a lot, like in the community that I come with, is yes, it would be better to, like, let's say we were to take Goku and we were put him in a fight against Superman. We could speculate all day in that. I mean, if we see the actual fight, then there's the definitive. However, you have to take the information that you're given and put it out in such a way that it makes logical sense. Is that how it's going to happen? Not necessarily. And I think that translates here where because you said you would prefer something besides a story and all that, or reconstruction, correct? But how would you propose I'd go about doing that? Giving you something besides those? Because I couldn't just, I have a dog somewhere around here. I couldn't just pull her up and then just have her evolve in front of you. I can't do that.
It takes time. It takes enough changes to accumulate. I understand. And since the evolutionist also believes that most of the genome is essentially neutral junk and that most mutations are strictly neutral, they'll say that these mutations build up and over time they act as a hidden reservoir of novel change at some point. So my question to you, or my response to you, is not that we have to see it before our very own eyes, but what we do see in terms of the proposed mechanisms for large-scale evolution, we actually find that the majority of mutations, which we agree add the necessary variation for selection to act upon, turn out to be overwhelmingly deleterious, damaging, and harmful to organisms. Okay, the human mutation rate, for example, and in general mammals, the mutation rate's high. It's about 100 new mutations per person per generation in humans. Most of these being effectively neutral. Okay, slightly deleterious, but not to the point where selection can see them. They're essentially invisible to selection, and they lead to genetic sickness over time. What this says to me, Ken, is more time doesn't give you large scale change. More time actually gives you more extinction events. So if species cannot persist for millions of years into the future because of mutation accumulation, then how could species persist for millions of years into the past? Right? If you don't have a mechanism for the large scale change, then you can't really say that it happened, because you can't explain how it happened, would be my point. So yeah, we don't need to see it today, but what we can see today are the mechanisms in action, selection and mutations, and they don't lead to the type of novel change that you would be required to have to take a fish to fishermen. Does that make sense? And what would be your thoughts on that? Take your time, Ken.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. Honestly, the mutation rate, it makes sense when you think of it in that way, that most are detriment. But I guess I'd have to ask what you mean by that, to be honest. What do you mean by their detriment? What do you mean by they're neutral? Like, are you saying like when they happen, they just cause like automatic harm to the body, or do you mean like they just are harmful in nature in general?
That's a good point. Let me share screen for you just so we can, because that's a very good question, and this way we can kind of understand it better. So by nearly neutral or effectively neutral, what I mean is precisely what population geneticists mean, evolutionary population geneticists. Right here, Michael Lynch, the human germline mutation rate. An average newborn contains 100 de novo mutations, right? So it's pretty high. And they've done numerical simulations, Ken, where even if only 10 of these were truly deleterious, because again, the evolutionary community assumes that the majority of mutations are truly neutral, because they'll say that the majority of the genome is junk, right? So the mutation hits, but doesn't really do anything because it's just hitting a junk area of the genome. We can get into that a little bit more later. It's my position that the entire junk DNA paradigm has been overturned. But for sake of argument, they've done numerical simulations, okay, using a program called Mendel's Accountant, where you can invoke very realistic biological parameters. And they discovered that even if the majority of the genome was just junk, if it was only 10% functional, that would still be too much for evolution to occur, because even 10 is too much. The evidence actually suggests that the genome is roughly 80% functional, maybe more. So that's about 80 that accumulate from generation to generation. So that means evolution really is, if evolution cannot occur, if the genome's 10% functional, it can't occur if the genome's 80% functional. But here's the one thing I'll say, and then take your time. This is evolutionary population geneticist, Kimura, for example. Under the present model, effectively neutral, okay? This is what I say, effectively neutral, but in fact, very slightly deleterious mutants. So what an effectively neutral mutation is and what it means, Ken, and it's a good question. It is a mutation that is only slightly deleterious, like a single rust molecule on a car, or a single spelling mistake in a book the size of an encyclopedia. Okay. It's not going to completely ruin the book or ruin the car, destroy the car. It'll just be slightly damaging. Okay. And that's what the majority of mutations are in the genome. They're only slightly deleterious, not to the point where it prevents reproduction, right? Selection involves the death of an individual, because if an individual is removed from the equation, they're not reproducing, they're not passing on their genes. But the majority of mutations are not bad enough to actually kill an organism. Some do, and selection sees those. One single point mutation can kill a person, an individual. But most of the mutations, just like Kimura says here, or right here, Iyer Walker, and these aren't young Earth creationist sources. I'll present this one, Ken. I'd love to get your thoughts on it. And don't feel like you're on the spot or anything. This is just free flowing. So it says, it seems unlikely that any mutation is truly neutral in the sense that it has no effect on fitness. So this is what I'm saying, Ken. All mutations must have some effect, even if that effect is vanishingly small. So essentially, that's what I'm saying. Most mutations, they're only slightly deleterious, slightly damaging to the organism, but not nearly enough to kill the organism. And therefore they accumulate. They're subject to genetic drift. They're invisible to selection. Selection can't see them, do anything about them. They build up. What are your thoughts on that? And does that answer your question, Ken?
Kind of. It got me mostly. I still got a few more, but we can deal with that later. Sorry, you started moving slides for some reason. That started messing with my head.
Yeah. So essentially, my question is, if selection can't filter out all of the bad mutations, the majority of them are slightly deleterious. But you're saying that, well, look at a mud skipper today, for example, or, imagine this in the past, or imagine this into the future, looking at a mud skipper, right? And essentially looking to historical reconstructions if you look to extinct organisms. Okay. But the point is, we see today the empirical evidence is mutations, natural selection. Can mutations and natural selection lead to the type of large-scale evolution that you're saying that you believe in, right? Dogs, wolves, and banana plants are related through common ancestry. Is this possible? Because anybody can give a story. Anybody can say, well, maybe it happened this way or happened that way, or maybe into the future it could happen this way. But if you can't show me how it happened, then it's just a story. It's just a historical reconstruction. It's nothing more. So my basic question is then, Ken, in your opinion or in your view, how can we solve this genetic degeneration process? If large scale evolution is true, how has selection removed all these deleterious mutations, these very slightly deleterious mutations that have been pouring in to the genomes of living organisms generation after generation? What are your thoughts on that, Ken?
Part of that, it kind of assumes that you would have to remove them. So part of what would be within the evolutionary guidelines is you take what you're given and you run with it in such a way that it can be used. So because you said in your what you were saying there is that it doesn't necessarily kill the organism. It accumulates over time within the living one that cannot be detected, correct?
Exactly. The majority of them, they accumulate. Like, for example, you accumulated roughly 100 new mutations from your parent, 50 from dad, 50 from mom.
Those
okay.
jerks.
Most of those, probably all of those, were just slightly deleterious. They accumulated, they got through, the germ cell line. You have them, but none of them were big enough to kill you. None of them were big enough to kill me. I've got 3 kids. I've passed on my genes. But it doesn't mean that they weren't damaging in some way. It doesn't mean that they were slightly deleterious. It just means they weren't bad enough to actually kill the organism. It doesn't mean that they were bad enough to stop me from reproducing or you from reproducing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that's kind of what I was getting into is the idea. What's detrimental to me won't necessarily be detrimental to my ancestors so many years. So, like, let's say I get a genetic make that gives me an extra finger. I'm not going to be able to wear gloves as much. That's going to be detrimental, but I'll be able to grab things better. So just because it's detrimental in the moment doesn't necessarily it's always going to be. And that's kind of, even if we sit there and say 100% of mutations are detrimental, as long as it doesn't kill the organism, then it still has the potential to be useful down the line. So what's detrimental now won't always be so. And that's kind of what it assumes, is that you would have to get rid of it anyway.
And those are some interesting points. See, if I was born with no hands, let's say, a mutation, I've lost my hands. Well, that sucks. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be able to have kids. So I can still have kids. Heck, I could be born without my hands and my feet, right? But I can still have kids and I can pass on my genes. And I would be passing on the mutations that I've accumulated from my parents to my kids, right? So generation after generation, humans are getting worse genetically. Okay. But if I inherited a certain mutation that was degenerative enough where it strongly reduced my lifespan and I couldn't reproduce, then selection would remove me out of the equation. And that's what we see today is we see an increase in So many diseases, cancers are skyrocketing, immunological diseases, asthma, autoimmune diseases, autism clearly has a genetic component to it. So as time goes on, mutations accumulate, diseases are manifested. So again, if species can't persist then for millions of years into the future, how can they persist for millions of years into the past? You're saying, well, maybe our ancestors, maybe they weren't quite as deleterious as they are today, right? But I mean, where's the evidence for that? That would have us believe that. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, to be fair, autism can be very useful in that. I'm just going to have to point that out because I have it. It helps with seeing the world in a different way from what you normally would. But so you said that nowadays we're seeing more stuff like asthma and stuff like that, and because
autoimmune diseases, cancers.
Would you mind if I ask you why that is then?
Right. So as disease as mutations accumulate, what we're seeing is over time is more mutation related diseases popping up. Does that make sense? The more mutations the population has, the more diseases there are in the population.
Would you say there was a moment in time where humans have lived longer than they do now?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I would say if you take
why
this,
did I even ask that? Why did I even ask that?
if you take, well, you know from the Bible, that's why you're thinking that. So if we take this point of most accumulating mutations, right, most increased genetic loads, back to a point of least increasing mutation accumulation, a time of perfection, well, then you would have a point in time where your genomes were healthier, people were healthier, and people could live longer. Because we know today we die primarily due to mutation accumulation, mutations in the somatic cell lines, telomeres shorten over time, and it's typically genetic. Environment has a factor to play in it as well. A lot of our antioxidant levels are depleted, and a lot of our longevity genes have been destroyed. Go back to a point in time where these longevity genes are good to go, they're fully working, fully functioning, then yes, logically humans would have lived a lot longer. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, I got very low. I got distracted by I'm gonna have to turn off my phone because I got distracted by the comments going by. Can you just hit me on the tail end?
No, that's good. That's good. We've got a good group here in the chat. So Ian Chen, appreciate it. Ian Chen official. If humans are getting worse, why do we have a problem with population growth? It would seem to me we are in fact over thriving. So I would say that there is exponential growth. People are having a lot of kids. I wouldn't say that the earth is overpopulated, but within the population of about 7 billion people, we've got thousands and thousands of mutations. We've got every year more and more mutation related diseases popping up. And here's what I typically say and point out, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Ken. Okay, for sake of argument, because there is variation in fitness. There are things to consider. Okay. For sake of argument, if we were to just say, okay, we know every single human being essentially is multiply mutant. What I mean by that is we've all accumulated mutations. There's nobody on this planet that doesn't have mutations, right? X-Men, right? Hopefully one day we'll get Wolverine style powers with super healing. So some more mutant than others, sure. Nonetheless, every human being multiply mutant. Now, selection can see the worst mutations, and selection can act upon the, let's say, best beneficial mutations. But we could get into that. Typically, beneficial mutations are like 1 in a million. They're pretty rare, and when they do occur, and you examine them genotypically on the genotype, you actually find that they're generally reductive. So even your rare beneficial mutations actually reduce genetic functionality, but we can get into that a bit later. So even though selection can manifest, the best beneficials and get rid of the worst detrimental mutations, it can't do anything against these nearly neutral mutations that build up, they're subjected to genetic drift, and they accumulate. So if every single human being on the planet, let's say we have a large population, as Ian's pointed out, 7 billion people. if for sake of argument, we were to just remove 50% of the worst, Ken, 50% of the worst mutants on the planet. So we're left with 4 billion, hypothetically, I'm not advocating for this, but let's just say for sake of argument. So we're left with 4 billion people. Are humans now better off than a few generations ago, Ken? No, because now we have 4 billion people that are still more mutant than the generation before it. Isn't that right? So we got rid of 4 billion of the worst, but now we're left with what? 4 billion people who are more mutant than the generation before it. So even for sake of argument, to just give the evolutionary side the most effective selection, grant them massive levels of selection, it doesn't solve the problem. Over time, mutations still accumulate and populations descend more and more into genetic sickness. Does that make sense? And if not, tell me why. And what are your overall thoughts on that?
No, I get what you're saying, but again, it kind of falls under the idea, and I'm sorry if this sounds repeated, but again, it falls under the idea that once it's negative, it's just going to stay negative. So the reason why I would say it isn't better, because now those 40 million mutations that are gone, any that could have potentially been useful are now just erased. And then any that they might have helped to make positive are just going to stay negative as well. So you have more chance of stuff staying bad than getting better by taking away those 40 million negatives.
See, here's the thing, though. The type of beneficial mutations that we see that would actually lead to some kind of beneficial variation is akin to spelling mistakes in a text. So over time, let's say each text, you copy it out and you introduce new errors to the text. Okay, so your text is becoming more diverse, right? Or let's say you have 40 computers with a specific program, and every time that program updates, a new error accumulates somehow. So over time, you have 40 computers that accumulate more errors as you get updates. So now, these computers are more diverse. They're not more diverse for the better, though. These books, these texts wouldn't be more diverse for the better. There's more mistakes. There's more errors that are actually making the text or the computer program itself, it's creating more gibberish. It's destroying the message. And that's what we see today is we don't see this type of beneficial variation you're talking about. Like you wipe these people out and we lose beneficial variation. Well, the type of beneficial variation we get is like a car, right? You get a brand new car and then, the dings, the rust marks, the scratches, the dents. That's the kind of, sure, your car's more variation on the car, but it's not for the better. What are your thoughts on that, Ken?
Well, I mean, that's certainly one way. Well, let's say like your car ends up getting covered in mud that just won't come off. Now you find yourself with a car that's got that extra layer on it. It's got more protection to it. It won't actually get scratched as much. In the winter, it'll actually stay warmer for you. Theoretically, in the summer, it can stay cooler because the light isn't getting in as easily. So that actually would go both ways. However likely your car's going to get covered in mud like that, I don't know. What have you been doing? But to your point, I was looking up the guy because I can't remember his name. I think it was like Michael Malloy.
Who's the guy? Like, what does he have to do with mutation accumulation?
Well, I'm more just addressing the book point at this point with typos and all that.
Right.
He made a book that was filled with all of them, but it was because of those typos and all that made the book better than what it was.
So you're saying a book accumulated typos over time and it actually made the book better?
Yeah. So even in the theoretical that you were giving, it would still work. Even with a book that just has a bunch of typos making it worse, it could still be better depending on how it gets looked at and all that, because it's sold better than most modern books.
I'd love to see a book that over time you introduce spelling mistakes every single generation, and after enough time it makes the book better. I'd like to see that. I mean, I'd be fascinated to see that.
I will send you it. The guy made a second book, and one of the things was at the very end of it, he just put a bunch of periods, exclamations, and all that, because his first book had none of them, and he was just like, "Here, put these wherever you want."
So, what I'd like to point out is something I pointed out earlier, in that this idea of mutation accumulation, genetic degeneration, right? It's actually been validated, and I've got a bunch of papers here going over the biologically realistic numerical simulations. Okay, and they've done it all. Thousands of these, super beneficial mutations, ample amounts of selection, assume the genome's junk, and every single time what we get is populations getting worse over time, degenerating, not getting any better. So again, and it goes back to this slide here, if we are to believe that not only, wolves and chihuahuas are related, but that wolves, horses, whales, mosquitoes, and banana plants are related, we're going to have to see empirical evidence for how the proposed mechanisms for that kind of change could actually lead to that kind of change, or else it's just a historical reconstruction that can pretty much be tossed out if we cannot be shown how this could happen. And one thing I'll say, I'll kind of shift topics here, is you brought up some interesting points earlier on like mud skippers and the possibilities of change. And that is, we do find some interesting creatures, right, Ken? We find today platypus, mud skippers, an otter, is interesting. We find some interesting mosaics. In the fossil record, we find some interesting mosaics as well. Tiktaalik, Archaeopteryx, you can see here. You could look to the mammal-like reptiles, right? You got fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and you have these interesting creatures, the synapsids, where they almost blend features of reptiles and mammals. Okay, mammal-like reptiles. So we find very interesting creatures. And we find homologous structures. We find nested hierarchical patterns. Ken, would you say that the reason why a human and a chimpanzee share more with each other in terms of genetics, morphology, anatomy, and physiology, you wouldn't look to that as common design? You would say, well, the reason why a human and a chimpanzee share more than, say, a human and a mouse or a human and a salamander is because humans and chimpanzees, they shared a common ancestor in, let's say, between 6 and 10 million years ago, where humans and a mouse, or humans and lizards, they would have a more distant common ancestor. So as populations diverge, populations independently accumulate changes, mutations, and so they become more and more different. Right. So this is a reflection of descent with modification, according to your model, nested hierarchies, right, Ken?
Well, because I need to stop treating it like it's a debate, to be honest. If I were to sit here and be 100% honest with you, if I were to take that idea by itself, I think it's good evidence for actually more common design than evolution.
Are you saying the fact that like humans and chimpanzees are more alike than humans and lizards? You're saying that on the surface level looks like common design?
Yeah, if I were to be 100% honest, if we were to take that and isolate it from everything else that can be talked about within this subject, that would be more common. It's one of those things where I don't like where people sit there and say, well, monkeys and humans are really close to each other. It's like, that doesn't necessarily mean they evolved. Right. And I'm just trying to say that just for the sake of showing that I'm not trying to be.
Some agreements. Well, I mean,
I would
agree
bias here on my end.
Right. Well, I would agree with you that, the so-called best lines of evidence for evolution, like nested hierarchies, homology, transitional forms, I believe these lines of evidence, they are what are called non-discriminatory lines of evidence. I think both models can explain them. Why do we see shared structures in the biological world? Well, we would say common design. And the evolutionists would say, well, we inherited them from a common ancestor, right? And, that they can be modified over time because organisms and populations split and diverge from each other. So, they have an explanation. The interesting mosaics we find extant and extinct. The evolutionists would say, these are your perfect intermediates, essentially, from the different major groups. And the nested hierarchical patterns here, they would say this is reflection of descent with modification. Humans and chimpanzees share more than humans and fish because of time changes and descent with modification. While we would say, well, in the same way a sedan and a SUV share more, right, than say a sedan and an airplane, well, we find the same hierarchical patterns in design modes of transportation, even these interesting mosaics. I'd be curious of your thoughts on this, Ken, and take as much time as you want, because I think this is an important topic. Is we actually
I
find...
don't like that you have the bike under the airplane, by the way.
You don't like the bike there?
I don't like the bike there. It looks weird because it's like, oh, here's a bike and here's a jet plane, and then just goes all the way back to car. Like, oh, we got boring.
It got boring quick. Well, I mean, look at your typical phylogenetic trees or phylogenies. You got a human, a mouse, I guess a salamander and a fish. Okay, a little bit of a less gap, a lesser gap than. But you got some of these trees where you've got like the single-celled like ancestor at the bottom. And, out into your different branches, you got dinosaurs, whales, sponges, so on and so forth. So my point is, though, from the design perspective, Ken, and I'll explain my model briefly. I'd love to get your thoughts on it instead of putting you on the spot all the time. Of the evolutionist, I do believe as a creationist, we do got to provide a more superior model. We can't just attack evolution.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I don't think you're putting me on the spot. I just want you to feel, because you're not. It's just a discussion, so I don't want you to feel like you have to apologize or anything.
Okay, I appreciate it. You've been great to chat with. So from the design perspective, okay, we start from the Bible, we start from Genesis, and God tells us that He created man in His own image. So a specific model that I would hold to, at least, is we would then hypothesize. We would say, okay, if we're made in the image of God, there must be something about us that reflects the divine, right? That should make sense. And so maybe we can get a sense for how God designed the biological world based on how we, as human engineers, design things. Well, it so happens to turn out that we design interesting mosaics. Have a look at this. The military amphibious assault vehicles. You got these interesting vehicles, these perfect intermediates between sea and land. Okay, an amphibious assault vehicle, it's neither perfect for land, it's like a tank. It's not perfect for the water like a ship, a military ship, but it is perfect for that transition, that environmental transition from what? Sea to land. Think of the movie Saving Private Ryan, as they're coming in, and these military vehicles allow for that transitional period where the soldiers essentially have to get onto land from the sea. We also find these interesting crossovers. This is an interesting one, the Jeep Gladiator. My parents recently got one of these. And the first thing I said when I saw it, I said, there you go. There's evolution, the perfect intermediate. I mean, it's neither truck nor Jeep. It's this interesting designed supposed intermediate, but it's not. It's designed that way. Crossover SUVs, same thing. Okay. Last thing I want to say is we see nested hierarchies in the design world. So we see nested hierarchies, designers build in homologous patterns, and we see interesting mosaics. What do we find in the biological world? Homologous patterns, nested hierarchical patterns, and we also see interesting mosaics. So my point would be is these observations, they are in accord with common ancestry and common design. And so what we have to do then, Ken, okay, is look to what's called discriminatory lines of evidence. We need to look to lines of evidence that can actually differentiate between the model. If I said, Ken, the sky is blue, the earth is round, unless you're a flat earther, I apologize. There's nothing to fear but the sphere itself. So I'm just kidding, I know you're not. So if I were to say, Ken, the earth is round, the sky is blue, therefore creation is true, you would be like, what in the world? Evolution can also explain why the sky is blue and the earth is round. Okay. This is non-discriminatory lines of evidence. The grass is green because of evolution. The grass is green because of creation. Both models can explain the data. We need to look to that which can differentiate the models. And I find evolutionists oftentimes look to the non-discriminatory lines of evidence, homologous patterns, even patterns in the different stages of embryological development. They'll look to interesting mosaics, historical reconstructions, things like this. This isn't going to help us answer the question of ancestry, okay? We need to actually discuss discriminatory lines of evidence. And I think that's where creation actually comes out on the stronger side. I said a lot there. I tried to break down the creation model as easily and quickly as I can, Ken. So I do appreciate your patience and your courteousness. Go ahead. What are your thoughts on all that? And go ahead, take your time.
Well, no, that's good. Take all the time you need. Again, it's just a conversation, right? But as far as for the for this argument particularly, it's not one I'm fond of because, as you said before, it doesn't prove either or point. It's actually kind of insulting to both points as well. So for the evolutionary line, it's insulting because it just it's kind of a cop out in a way because again, it doesn't necessarily prove it. It's just like these things are the same, therefore they have to evolve from each other. My phone and my laptop, my tablet, I used to have my Switch, they all have a screen, they're all electronical, they all play videos. Doesn't necessarily mean they would have evolved from each other. However, my problem with it going the other way is we're not as powerful or smart as God. So to sit there and say, because we see these things in our world, kind of assumes that that's how he would do it. But I don't. It doesn't make sense to me because again, he's a lot more intelligent. He can do more than we could as a species, if that ultimately makes any sense.
Right. And Ken, there's a few things I want to say there. We're just hitting the hour mark. So what we're going to do is take a 2-minute break. I've been drinking a lot of water. I know you have as well. So we're going to have that 2-minute bathroom break. And while we're doing that, if there's anybody in the chat that wants to send in any questions, please do so. And we will be back in exactly 2 minutes. Okay, we are back, Ken, for the second hour. I hope everybody in the chat is enjoying the conversation. Time does fly by. And if you're just joining us, make sure at a different time, check out the first hour. We talked a lot about creation evolution, the mechanisms behind large-scale evolution. and aspects of the creation model, mainly the non-discriminatory aspects of the creation model. So one thing I want to say, Ken, based on what we just ended with in the last portion, a couple points you made, is you're right. God is so much more greater than us. And we are just in the infancy of understanding and recognizing design. Okay. So when we find, for example, these interesting mosaics that we talk about, that the evolutionists would conclude are, intermediate transitional species. Well, I was pointing out how design modes of transportation now appear intermediate in a sense. Crossover vehicles, amphibious assault vehicles, military amphibious assault vehicles, just a couple examples. But still, we are just catching up to that which God has already thought of, right? And he's designed in this way. He's even designed organisms with the ability to change rapidly via environment. We have this extra layer of complicated information, okay, essentially on top of the genetic code called the epigenome, where we have millions of genetic switches just waiting to be turned on via environment for adaptive change. Okay, we need some kind of control mechanism. Ken, if every gene was turned on at the same time, that wouldn't be good. Okay, so we actually have a control mechanism in our genome that can dictate, okay, when certain genes are turned on and off. And we have strong evidence for forward thinking. We have mechanisms in our genome like this that can be amplified or manifested, come to the forefront, even leading to a phenotypic change. I mean, we have a ton of morphological adaptability built into these systems of living organisms, okay? But this capacity for this kind of change is pre-existing. But the point I want to make is, in design modes of transportation, not until recently have human engineers front-loaded various vehicles with safety features, different types of features that, if you're driving down the highway and you start swerving off a little bit to the left or to the right, there's actually a mechanism built into the car where lane control, it puts you right back into the lane, or someone's coming close to you from behind, your car starts to beep, things like this, forward thinking, right? But again, God already thought of that. We are so behind. And a lot of the lines of evidence that evolutionists have looked to, okay, they're not actually recognizing the fact that this is evidence for good design. This is evidence for forward thinking. This is how human engineers are actually starting to build and design things. So I did like that point you made, that God is so much greater. I mean, how much front loading is in our smartphones? I mean, there is so much compressed information in here, endless apps that you can download, and manifest essentially. So anyways, that, is kind of the ripple effect of some of the points you made. What are your thoughts on that overall, and anything you'd like to add, Ken?
That's not a whole lot I can think to add. I think I said mostly what I needed to say in that point.
So one thing I would like to say first, actually, what I should do is Bubblegum Gun. Appreciate the super chat. I will give a shout out to people in the chat. If you guys do have questions for Ken, let's say on creation evolution, he is going to be here on Wednesday debating Kent for the sequel. If you got any questions for Ken or myself, just tag me, let me know. So now, Ken, what I'd like to ask you is, given what we talked about in the first half, okay, you are convinced, you're a theistic evolutionist, you're convinced that evolution is true. All life is related, whales and banana plants are related, essentially. Okay.
To be fair, you don't really have banana plants. Bananas are more the mechanism used to carry the seed to create the tree.
So every seed that creates a tree, of a fruit tree, essentially shares a relationship, though, with animals. Animals and plants, they go back to that universal root, that last universal common ancestor, right?
The tree specifically, but yeah, you get the idea. And sorry, I just needed to point that out because every single time I hear it, it sounds weird to me. It's like saying that you are your...
Right. So my question would be then, Ken, what is an additional line of evidence that convinces you that, let's say, humans, and we can even stick within mammals, humans and whales are related through common ancestry? You know, we discussed the mechanisms in hour one, based on a first kind of observation that you thought was convincing. Therefore, what is a secondary line of evidence, would you say, that is convincing?
The next line of evidence I would say is, it's going to sound similar to homologous, but I butchered that word. It's going to sound
I've heard people say homologous. I've heard people say homologous. So it's okay. I don't think anybody knows how to truly say it. You're good.
It sounds similar to it isn't, but
actually, let me say this, Ken, real quick before the chat goes off. Okay, testament here. Or I'm not sure. Bananas branched off. We are not related. I'm not sure if he's critiquing myself or you, but yeah. So the universal phylogenetic tree, it was Darwin who essentially said, you know, it is a fact that all plants and all animals should be related. I mean, if you reject special creation or separate ancestries, I hold to the separate ancestry model, then you have to say that no matter what you're looking at, a strawberry, a tomato, a whale, a human, a chimpanzee, you do have to say for the most part that everything is connected. Everything goes back to a common ancestor. Of course, there's been divergence and there's been plenty of splits, but ultimately every branch connects to that root. And evolutionary biologists will have no problem in admitting that.
Well, so see, for anybody, I can prove that dogs and trees are related.
Dogs and who?
I can prove that dogs and trees are related.
Cretes?
Trees.
Oh, trees. Why? Because they both bark? I like it, Ken. I like the sense of humor. You know, elephants and bananas are both related. I mean, they're both yellow except for the elephant. So, you know, an elephant and a banana plant and a bowling ball are related because they're all affected by gravity. And this is what I find with the evolutionists is they rely far too much on classification, systematics, taxonomy. I mean, if I drew a circle big enough, Ken, and I labeled the circle things that breathe. I mean, I can put anything into that circle. Things affected by gravity, modes of transportation that, you know, move a person from one place to another. I mean, you can group things. Humans group things all the time. Your tools, their books, your movies into different categories. I don't really think that the animals, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You look at a species and you want to categorize them in a family or a kingdom or a phylum or a class or whatever. I don't think they really care where they're being put. Okay, I don't think the platypus cares how you classify it. But anyways, I'm going on too much of a rabbit trail. Ken, again, I apologize for interrupting. Wanted to get that comment up there. What's an additional line of evidence that's convincing to you of universal common ancestry?
For me, one of the other convincing things has been, if you look down what would be, and I know you don't believe in it, so obviously it's not going to be too convincing for you, but if you look at what would be considered our ancestors within the fossil record, you see similarities and the transitions within those things. So I know you usually debate the human line, right?
So you said the transitional forms in what lineage?
Well, just between like what people have come to mark as past forms for certain animals to their current forms. You see the transitions. I'm not saying any one particular, just because each animal that lives currently has one. So just to be fair, stick to your expertise of the human evolutionary line.
Well, I think regardless of what line you look at, this goes back again to what I believe is a non-discriminatory line of evidence, okay? Your best transitional forms that you could point to in any line, Ken, okay, you can look to Tiktaalik, you can look to the mammal-like reptiles, you can look to Archaeopteryx, you can look to whatever, the whale series. Okay, we find some interesting mosaics. I agree. Now, what we're looking at today is just a snapshot of the overall diversity on the planet. Okay. I mean, how many species of rhino are there today? How many in the fossil record? You've got a great variation of rhino like creatures, no horns, short horns, long horns, some bigger, some smaller, whatever. So in the past, we obviously had a greater diversity. We can see that in the fossil record. Okay. And again, this goes to this idea that humans build some interesting mosaics. And this is why I believe, again, these so-called intermediates, just because they may look intermediate, just because they're interesting, just because they blend, the features of various creatures, let's say like the synapsids, doesn't actually provide us discriminatory evidence for common ancestry, because again, the design hypothesis can explain the same thing. Okay. Interesting mosaics, I don't believe, is going to be a good way for us to differentiate between the models. Again, what I pointed out earlier, the military, the amphibious assault vehicle, one could conclude this is the perfect intermediate between a ship built for the ocean, military ship, a land vehicle like a tank built for the land. To the evolutionists, this is your intermediate. But no, all three are designed for what they are to do. And that's exactly what we see with, I would say, your best mosaics, your best intermediates, intermediate-like, tictolic. Yeah, go ahead. What are your thoughts on that?
I was just going to say, I think my biggest problem with that, as it stands, is one with the humologics and all that, the way that we're looking at it. Those things, they exist in the same space.
They exist in the what?
They exist in the same space-time. Well, the things I'm talking about didn't exist at the same space-time, so they're not necessarily designed to exist at the same point. And therefore, like we were talking about at the beginning of this, kind of like how updates and all that happen. So my phone and my laptop are two different things. However, the Windows 11 is definitely a step down from the Windows 12.
But here's the thing. If every single domestic dog today drowned in a flood, okay, there's 450 breeds, interesting breeds, from your Great Dane to your Husky to your Chihuahua to your Shih Tzu. Okay. There's a massive amount of variation. As a matter of fact, in extant species, Ken, there oftentimes exists more variation within the same species than across or between. That's problematic, because today in extant species, we have genetics. We can do breeding tests. Genetics is the best way to determine ancestry. Genes, traits, and genetics, that's what's inherited sperm and egg. Not a fossil that has no genetics, not a fossil that we understand would exist in a population that we can't do breeding tests. Okay. This is a problem for a fossil species, because my question to you, Ken, is, before I make the question, let me finish my point here, actually, before I get to that question, because I think it'll probably branch us off into another topic. But if all these domestic dogs were to drown and we dig them up, well, they exist today in the same, space-time continuum, I guess, if you want to put it. But yet we could line them up. We can line them up and say, this evolved into this, because there's so much variation in Canis domesticus alone. Okay. Actually, more variation within Canis domesticus than between, Canis lupus, Canis coyotes, Canis whatever. Okay. And you could do the same thing in the fossil record with your different rhino species. I mean, you pick the group, and we could form some kind of line that looks transitional. I mean, here we've got a two-wheeler, a four-wheeler, and therefore, if evolution is true, we would predict what? A three-wheeler, a three-wheeled tricycle, and lo and behold, there it is. But my question to you then, if you want to look to the fossil record, is how can we determine, without genetics and without breeding tests, right? We know all domestic dogs are related because we can determine that. Breeding tests, we bred them for the most part artificially, and we have their genetics. But a fossil species, how can you tell what is the result of homology and what is the result of homoplasy or convergent evolution, the independent origin of specific traits? How can you tell the difference, Ken?
Well, realistically, as far as if I'm because I'm going to have to give a realistic answer. I don't necessarily have one for that. It's one of those things that I've currently been looking into and all that myself. It's one of the things when I get a chance to talk to Snake, I'm definitely going to harp on about, because I actually haven't ever heard a good answer for that. It's actually why it wasn't my first point for why I believe in evolution when that was brought up. Theoretically, it all could just be stuff that happened to exist, and those creatures just went extinct as well. They just happen to look similar as well, if we were to be honest. But I think there's definitely the possibility that that's not it as well. It's an argument to possibility, but that doesn't necessarily make it false either.
And that's a major issue with historical reconstructions with the fossil record, is the fact that the variation today is oftentimes greater within the same species than between. So then you want to look to a fossil sequence or a fossil group and try and say, you know, these are related and this group is related to another, and then we've got an intermediate, for example. You can't really, and I agree, I've asked that question numerous times and I've never been presented with, I think, what would be a sufficient answer. And convergent evolution is very interesting, because we have these similar structures, similar architecture in terms of these different creatures. For example, here we've got a dolphin, a shark, and an ichthyosaur, right? They've got such amazing similarity, streamlined bodies and fins, right? Dolphins and sharks, we know they're not closely related. Same with the ichthyosaur. They didn't inherit their similar body shapes from a common ancestor. So the point is, their streamlined bodies, dorsal fins, and flippers are the result of what? Not homology. Now, they are related ultimately on the tree, but more distantly. These traits actually evolved independently. Now, to me, as a creationist, no, these three don't share relationship. They're part of a separate ancestry, part of a different independent origin. But to the evolutionists, they have to say, well, you know, they're in a similar environment, and that is why, you know, they essentially evolve the same, streamlined bodies, flippers, features, traits, so on and so forth. But do you see how this is a real difficulty in the fossil record to determine, you know, what is homologous, what is homoplasy or convergent evolution? Because without genetics and breeding tests, a fossil can be quite deceiving. Would you agree with that, Ken?
Yeah, I could agree with that. Quick question: is that thing in the middle of a dinosaur?
The ichthyosaur is, well, a dinosaur would be like a land-dwelling creature, right?
No, not necessarily. They're a fish.
Like an like is a plesiosaur would taxonomically speaking, would it be correct to call a plesiosaur a dinosaur? A swimming dinosaur, but taxonomically speaking, would that be correct?
Yeah. Have you ever seen? You've seen Jurassic Park, right?
Oh yeah.
You know that big one with the giant spine on its back?
Yeah, the Spinosaurus.
Yeah, it actually spent most of its time in the water as well.
Right, which is interesting. I think there's a good case to be made that the Leviathan in the Bible could be a Spinosaurus, because a Spinosaurus spends a lot of its time in the water, but also on land. But you know, that's a side point. So yeah, an ichthyosaur is essentially would have existed in that era, that time of the dinosaurs. So, you know, that would just simply, I just wanted to point that out. That would be, you know, my problem with the fossil record and the so-called transitional forms, is that without genetics, without breeding tests, these fossils can be far too deceiving. And that is why I like to look to the differentiating lines of evidence. And not to put you on the spot, Ken, you know, I've asked you for one or two lines of evidence that have convinced you that the common ancestry is true. One line of evidence that I find convincing, and I'd be curious as to your thoughts. And I can pull it up here too for a visual, but I've got, as Kent likes to say, I've also got hundreds of slides here, so sometimes I can't find it quickly. So,
I got 2 slides, so you got enough for both of us.
A lot of critics, okay, they'll try and say, well, a lot of creationists like to spend far too much time focusing on distantly related creatures if evolution were true, right? Whales and pine trees, whales and strawberries. But for me, I like to stay as close to home as possible. If humans and chimpanzees are not related through common ancestry, if they never shared relationship, if humans don't belong on that universal phylogenetic tree, they're especially created, they're a totally different tree, I guess you could say, than any other form of life. That means universal common ancestry is not universal common ancestry. A creationist believes in common ancestry, but also separate ancestries. Not everything's connected. The proponent of common descent believes in universal common ancestry. Everything's related. So if I can show that humans and chimpanzees aren't related, which is supposedly our closest cousin, and we split from a common ancestor, 10 million years ago, 6 million years, there's varying numbers because of the waiting time problem. But that's besides the point. If I can show you that humans and chimpanzees aren't related, that completely crushes the universal phylogenetic tree. I don't even have to go into the origin of eukaryotic life or organisms, I can go as close to home as possible. And one line of evidence that I find to be a fatal blow to common ancestry, especially with the primate, has to do with, and I don't feel like you're on the spot. If you don't have an answer to this, that's completely fine. It may be something for you to look into. Okay. The human Y chromosome is uniparentally inherited DNA. Right? We get the Y chromosome from our father. You got your Y chromosome from your dad, right? My son, my two sons got their Y chromosome from me. They got their mitochondrial DNA from mom, but they got their Y chromosome from me. That's why we can build some very interesting Y chromosomal family trees. Every single male Y chromosome on the planet, nearly identical, incredibly low variation. And they all go back to a single Y chromosomal ancestor just 4,500 years ago, based on the fact that we also have a mutation rate in the Y chromosome that is incredibly fast. Okay. Low variation and a fast Y chromosome. Very interesting. But this is where my argument comes into play, Ken, and I'd be curious because you seem objective and open-minded. All right. Y chromosome is also non-recombining DNA. Your autosomal DNA, right? You get two copies, you get recombination, you get the exchanging of genetic information, essentially shuffling of these pre-existing DNA differences. It gets a little messy, a little tricky. But the uniparentally inherited DNA compartment is less messy, right? That's why we can build, again, these nice family trees that go back to one mitochondrial DNA ancestor, one Y chromosomal ancestor. When they sequenced the chimpanzee genome, they were surprised. It turns out that when you consider overall architecture, overall gene content, and overall size differences, because the Y chromosome between these two forms of life, humans and chimpanzees, is like half the size. When you consider all of those things, it's only about 35%, Ken. 35% the same. It's nothing alike. It's completely different. Every single human male Y chromosome, the same. Some minor variation, but the same. But yet our closest cousin, it's half the size. It's missing all of this gene content. And, here's something I'd like to say. The evolutionists, this is a challenge I've put out to the evolutionary community, and I'll just say it. They failed to address it. They are now going to have to apply mathematical models to try to demonstrate how a sequence can change extremely rapidly, including, notice this, Ken, wholesale rearrangement of significant parts and the evolution of entire gene families in only 6 to 10 million years since the split. So two questions, Ken. Have you heard of this argument? And if you have, what are your thoughts? If you haven't, on the spot, I guess, how would you address this discrepancy? Why is the Y chromosome just so different? Not just a little different, but just massively different. If common ancestry is true, go ahead, my good man.
Well, because at the beginning of this, we were talking about the mutation rates and all that. If we were to take that information into account with the fact that there's 6 to 5 million years between the split and all that, theoretically, we could end up with two different with that DNA line being completely different from each other. It's theoretically possible, and I know theoretically is a very slippery word, but I don't have any other way in which to describe it. It's not an impossibility. The fact that there is, because 35%, it's not half, but it's not too far off from being half. It's at least closer to it than I would like it to be, as far as if we were saying that they weren't at all related.
And that's a good response. I appreciate it, because that is what many evolutionists would say. The answers I've heard is a faster mutation rate or sperm competition with chimpanzees. They've typically have a polygamous relationships. So there's sperm competition, maybe a more rapidly changing Y chromosome or faster rates of what's called gene conversion. But here's the problem I have with that, Ken. Again, here's a Y chromosomal phylogenetic tree. Very few DNA differences separating any two people. Okay, this is a reflection of mutations over time, basically. And we've got a few. I think it's like maybe 300 to 450 DNA differences max between any two people on the Y chromosome. I could be slightly off on that, but I believe that that's about right. So every single human male Y chromosome, 99.999% similar. And we have a fast mutation rate.
Yeah.
To me, that means if you have low variation but a fast mutation rate, well, you can't push back humans then to 200,000 years for their Y chromosome atom. No, you've only got a couple hundred generations, few hundred generations max. Or else the Y chromosome in a rat, like you pointed out, if the Y chromosome is rapidly changing and accumulating more mutations. Remember, a mutation adds genetic diversity because it's adding something that was not previously there. So the Y chromosome should be more divergent. We should find some geographically divergent Y chromosomes in the human population, right? If populations have been isolated from each other and the Y chromosome is mutating fast, you would expect some divergence there. But we don't actually find that. And my question is then, if a faster mutation rate were to explain the discrepancy, well, then why is every single human male Y chromosome still nearly identical, Ken?
Okay, just so I understand what you're saying. So you're saying because there's humans that live so far away from each other, but their Y chromosome are still the same, that should, if this were to be true, then apes should be similar as well, just because of that, or am I misunderstanding what's being said?
Well, we understand the mutation rate's fast in the Y chromosome.
Yeah.
And you're saying, well, maybe because it's fast, since the split, you have humans going one way, chimpanzees going another, right? So chimpanzees are accumulating mutations and humans are accumulating mutations, the human line that is. And eventually we reach this point, right? You reach this point here where the human Y chromosome and the chimpanzee Y chromosome are only about 35% the same. If that's the case, though, how come in that time humans haven't diverged in their Y chromosome? Why is there still low variation in the human Y chromosome? 99.99% the same. If we had that much time to deal with, right, and the mutation rate is as fast as we know it is, my point is humans should not be so close in Y chromosomal variation. But then when we look to the chimpanzees, it's only about 35% the same. So you'd have to say, well, the chimpanzee line then mutated even faster than the human line. Does that make sense, what I'm saying here?
So you're saying like the chimpanzee line, their Y chromosome, they're 35% different from each other, so they have more diversity within theirs. So it's actually different from what, okay. Is that what I'm...
Well, chimpanzees, when compared to humans, the Y chromosome, it's about 35% the same when we consider overall architecture, size differences, and architecture. But when in fact it's non-recombining, it's less messy. It should be the most stable in a sense, but it is rapidly mutating. So my point is, if rapid mutation accumulation explains it, like you're saying, then my objection is humans then should not be so similar in the Y chromosome. We should not be so uniform. There's certain populations on the planet, right? Especially according to deep time evolution, that have been split for thousands of years or separated for the most part, that should also be different, right? Now, granted, chimpanzees like do have more diversity within themselves than humans do, granted. But in order for it to be empirical and this is where my issue is, and it's not your problem. You're just a layperson in this, and you're being very honest. The PhD evolutionists are not applying mathematical models to actually show us how these changes, these wholesale rearrangements, okay, can occur to explain these discrepancies. I understand that they can say, sperm competition, gene conversion, rapid mutation accumulation, but you would agree, Ken, that we would need empirical evidence for that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Any claim that's made needs to have the evidence to back it up. You can't say anything in it, no matter how accepted it is. That's just how that is. Because let's say something's been accepted for 1,000 years. Every child that's born isn't necessarily just going to know all the information that's gotten to that point. You still need to back it up.
Right. So that's my issue. I would just say look into it, because you gave a good answer. You didn't just say I don't know. And the question is now we need to take that answer and we need to see if it fits reality. Is this mathematically possible? Is this feasible? And I have yet to see any of the most militant evolutionists or the PhDs actually show me a mathematical model on how this could happen. Because you would admit that's a lot of changes that needs to occur, right? Yeah. At the split, correct me if I'm wrong, Ken, you have the split, the human and chimpanzee common ancestor, they split. One line goes one way, the other line goes the other, right? So the Y chromosome is essentially the same at the split, right? But the same. Now they split, chimpanzee line, human line. They both start to diverge from each other, right? So eventually you get to this point where the chimpanzee and the human line are now only 35% the same. So you understand that is a lot of change that needs to occur. And the question is it feasible? Is it feasible? And I would just encourage you to maybe look further into that. And the whole point of that is that was just one of what I believe is a fatal blow, I guess, to evolutionary theory. But yeah, we can certainly move on at that point. We've definitely touched on quite a bit, and I am looking at the at the chat here. So I'd be curious, and if you're a theistic evolutionist, do you agree that abiogenesis, essentially life from non-living chemicals, is pretty well impossible? Like, would you hold to the special creation of the first life at least?
Yeah. Well, how do I say this? I think the idea that life could start from chemicals is possible if something is there to make it so that it can happen, like a higher power. Like, again, so the way I view God is he exists separately than, so you're a comic nerd like me. One of the ways, like Mr. Piddlix, he's not affected by our space-time and all that. He's a fifth dimensional being. Our reality means nothing to him. So he could go to one point in time and do something and make literally impossible things happen. And that's how I view God in this sense. What we would perceive impossible, what would be impossible, is not impossible to him. So he could literally force that chemical thing to happen.
So that's an interesting point then. If it's not impossible for God, why does God only have to create the first self-replicating molecule? The first self-replicating cell, let's say. You got your single cell and then your multi-celled organism, fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, eventually man. Why then could not God have created groups of creatures, right? Genomic archetypes that actually already have the pre-existing ability to change, because he has front-loaded the original creatures, the original created archetypes of all species that live today and have ever lived in the past. Front-loaded them with huge levels of heterozygosity, so just a state of DNA diversity, and also various classes of DNA elements that can allow for change, that can allow for protection, like these ERV sequences, pseudogenes, ALU sequences, so on and so forth. Why could God then not have done that? in your view, Ken?
I don't think it's a question of if he couldn't. I think it's a matter of he was trying to be, because humans are very mentally fragile creatures. I'm sure you would agree with that. And I think if he goes down that route, he still has control, but also gives a sense of humans having some control as well. It's the way to be kind to us, to not freak us out, to allow us to explore our universe as well. Because one of the things that humans like to do is explore. It's kind of how, like, you would rearrange your backyard a little bit for your dog, or how you would. I had a lizard. One of the things you would do for it is change up its environment so it can explore. It's a kindness, really.
Ever-changing environments require ever-changing genome, right? So creatures can go into a new environment, they can explore, and they have the built-in mechanisms to adapt rapidly. You know, and I could screen share again. For sake of time, I won't, because we're coming up at the 2-hour mark. Papers today, technical papers today that have essentially shocked the evolutionary community, in that what we're seeing is rapid change. Evolutionary change requires, that's what I get for all my hand movements, but evolutionary change requires lots of time to accumulate DNA differences through mutations, that through recombination, isolation, migration, and the various mechanisms of speciation to see true change. But yet we see it before our very own eyes, because these mechanisms are already built into the genome, where you've got a certain creature that goes into an environment. Let's say a certain fish goes into a cold water, and bam, a genetic switch is turned on and they can rapidly adapt. We see this all the time. It's amazing. So the point is, we don't need evolution in the sense of large scale fish to fisherman evolution, Ken. So you're saying, well, God created, the first self-replicating cell, the first cell. But why? That's not needed. Plus the evidence that we see today in terms of mutations and selection refute that that's even possible, to take a single celled like ancestor into a whale over billions of years. So why not conclude what the data suggests, that there were independent ancestries that were front loaded with the ability to change as they enter new environments? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, to be fair, what you just described there is not something I wouldn't say is evolution. It could be considered a form of evolution. Just because it's controlled and already in there doesn't mean it's not. You know what I mean? Because it still would be the change over with it, even if it's within that lifetime. Because as we explained at the beginning of this, evolution by its definition for biological is just life changing over a period of time.
But remember, if that change is opposite of what is required for large-scale evolution, then that cannot be evidence for large-scale evolution. What we see is horizontal changes within the genome, right? We don't see vertical changes. We don't see, novel structures. We don't really see an increase in phenotypic complexity. Yeah, we do see morphological variation, morphological adaptability based on the pre-existing for that, the pre-existing change for that, the pre-existing ability for that change. So here's the thing, though. Natural selection does not see the long term, right, Ken? Mm-hmm. Natural selection sees the short term. It's not worried about getting cancer 50 years from now. It's worried about, how am I going to survive till tomorrow? Same with species. It doesn't see the long term. So my question is then, if this is evolution, Ken, how do evolutionary mechanisms like selection and mutations build that which requires forward thinking?
I'm going to have to ask you to explain your question a little bit in a little bit more detail. I'm not quite understanding what you mean.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Think about it. When a car designer, when an engineer builds a car with what? A spare tire. What's he doing? He's foreseeing the possibility that the driver of that vehicle is going to get a flat tire.
Yeah.
Right. It's winter. The roads are kind of crazy and the weather's bad, and he gets a flat tire. Well, thank God he's got the spare tire, right? That's been designed in the back of the car. He can go and he can replace it, and it's good. It's a fifth tire. It's redundant, but it's necessary in the case of a flat. This is human engineers using forward thinking. But that's also what we see in the genome. is we see a lot of redundancy. We see a lot of latent information just waiting to be expressed. We have a lot of recessive genes that are waiting to be expressed or manifested that lead to rapid adaptation. These are mechanisms and DNA elements within the genome that are there just waiting to be expressed or manifested via environment, just like the flat tire. So this is forward thinking. From my position, God is the forward thinker who front loaded the genomes of living organisms with various classes of forward thinking DNA elements. So that's my problem, is if you're saying, well, this is evolution, this is consistent, but wait a minute, selection doesn't see the long term, mutations degrade, mutations don't really produce beneficial variation. So how do they build that which requires forward thinking? How do they build? Here's an easy way to put it. How do evolutionary mechanisms build a spare tire?
How do have?
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm trying to think of the best way to even tackle that, because it's a fair question.
Well, because think about it, in computer code, redundancy is considered good. And yet we actually find evidence that at least 80% of the genome's active. We have a lot of activity. We have a lot of redundant elements. We have a lot of classes of DNA elements that are functional, essential for a number of things. Okay. And this all points us back to a designer, and it points us back specifically to what I call the design diversity hypothesis. You're saying God had to create just the first single-celled like ancestor. How does that help? Now you got to take the single-celled like ancestor into a whale over billions of years. But the evidence actually suggests that God created various groups of creatures and front-loaded them with pre-existing diversity. The diversity is already built in. But you have a single-celled like ancestor. You got to get that single-celled like ancestor into a whale. For my position, no, God creates groups of creatures, and the diversity, the beneficial diversity, it's already built into the organisms. Go ahead. Does that make sense?
Okay, no, I know. I understand. I think there was a miscommunication, because I never said that he necessarily only built that first one, because again, he exists separately from us. So all these things could have been made, and it just slowly came. If we were to go with he only made one cell at a time thing, it came out, and then he slowly made it so that it would change over time itself. He would be the person who made the third wheel itself. Not the third wheel. He would be the person who would still make the fifth wheel that animal would require. It just wouldn't become as soon as it came out as well. It would be something that he would slowly build up to and give it later on.
So is God in your model constantly intervening? Yeah, you have populations of single-celled like ancestors, and then eventually, God wants those single-celled like forms of life to evolve into a multi-celled organism. Is it your position that God intervenes, or this is just naturalistically happening?
God intervenes. If you look at the Bible, it clearly would state that God himself constantly is intervening with everything that life in itself is, but he's just trying to do it in a way that's what's the way I'm trying to put this? Makes sense to us humans, because again, he exists in such a higher reality than us that most things that he probably does wouldn't make sense to us. So he's probably trying to do it in such a way that we can comprehend. Which really, when you think about it, could be a good way to even prove that he exists if you wanted to go down that route.
So there's so many problems with the theistic evolution model.
Okay.
And a major problem is the fact that mutations, this goes back to the beginning, that mutations, they degrade. Mutations are not the creator, they're the destroyer. The biblical creationist model suggests that the majority of variation within the genome is not the result of mutation. It's the result of initial design, with mutations being rare, right? But most variation being the result of design. But the theistic evolutionary model still has to say, well, over time, mutations accumulate and they result in beneficial diversity that natural selection can act upon. But here's the problem, Ken. is, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on this as we wind down, and then of course ask me any final questions too. The fact that the junk DNA paradigm has been overturned, the majority of the genome is active and functional. That means that mutations can't really accumulate for extended periods of time. Okay, there's shelf lives on genomes, and the theistic evolutionist still wants to hold to the historical record that naturalistic evolutionists hold to, where you've got single-celled like ancestors, multi-celled ancestors, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, man. You're not going to get that sequence. You're going to get extinction, because that's why, Ken, population geneticists have held to and still hold to, they have to, that the majority of the genome is junk. Then at least the mutations that accumulate, right? Does this make sense? They hit the junk areas. They don't do anything. But if junk DNA no longer exists, you don't have enough shelf life for progressive evolution, for forward evolution. I think that's a fatal blow to common descent. And maybe that's just something for you to consider. What are your overall thoughts on that as we start to wind things down here?
I'm definitely got to look more into that, because if it is the way that you say it is, which I have no reason to believe that you would lie to me on this one, it definitely is something to question and try and figure out how that would work, because if that's true, that definitely is a problem.
And people in the chat, I appreciate that. People in the chat, they've most of their questions I've taken and then asked you. Like, has God intervened? And are you an atheist? No, you're a theistic evolutionist. And let's see here. So I think we pretty much got to him, Ken. 2 hours. See, and this is what this podcast is about. Low pressure, free flowing, organic. You know, it's not a competition, not some formal debate. And I think we got a lot of good discussion in where we understand each other's positions a lot more. Ken, is there any final questions you want to ask me? Any final points you want to make as we come up to the 2 hour mark here?
I can't think of too many myself, just because I just can't think of way too many. The only thing that I kind of wanted to talk about was, we talked about humans to chimpanzees. I was curious about your thoughts on the dog to wolf ancestry, but that's something we could talk about some other point if you're free time. Outside of that, no, I don't have anything.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I believe domestic dogs do go back to a common wolf ancestor, and according to our model, we would go back 4,500 years to the Ark. And based on the created heterozygosity model, we would have archetypes. Let's say you got a canid archetype, right? You've got a felid archetype and a bear archetype. Well, with the front loading of pre-existing DNA differences and recombination, the shuffling of those DNA differences every generation, from those archetypes, you can get, if we focus on, let's say the canid, because that was your question, you could get everything from a wolf to a coyote to a dingo to the domestic dog and everything in between, simply based on the pre-existing ability for those changes. And same with your felid archetype. You could get from those pre-existing functional differences, you can get everything from a tiger to a house cat to a jaguar and everything in between. How many species of bear? 8, I think. So with your bear archetype, you can get everything from your black bear to your brown bear to your polar bear and your grizzly bear.
Humans aren't really creative when it comes to bears.
Yeah, and a lot of evolutionists say, well, this is hyper evolution. It's not, because the mechanism for this change is actually, for the most part, shifts in what's called heterozygosity, so a greater state of DNA diversity, to homozygosity, which is a lesser state of DNA diversity. Homozygosity basically is a state of no DNA diversity. Heterozygosity, a state of DNA diversity. So these shifts over time, as these populations leave the Ark, they migrate, some become isolated, inbreeding occurs, and these shifts occur, genetically speaking. You get new variations quickly. It's all built in, right? But the evolutionists, they have to build up the DNA differences through mutations. The creationist already has them built in. And so change can come about quickly. Does that answer your question? Because your question was a good one, and I could probably give a 2-hour lecture on it. But that's more or less the answer in a nutshell. So wolves and domestic dogs, short answer, related, yes. And that would be how.
Yeah, that definitely tackles at least the base form of the question that I was going to go for. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, I think this was fun. This was beneficial. And anything else you want to say, especially for the audience sake? You're very cordial. You're courteous. You keep these conversations sophisticated and interesting. You keep them fun. We've been going nonstop for 2 hours, a 2-hour podcast discussion. So, host of comments here says, great chat, lads. I appreciate you being here. Guys, share these conversations around. These are important. We want to understand each other. We don't want to be an echo chamber. We want to get creationists. We want to get evolutionists, and we want to discuss our models. We want to discuss our views, and we want to come as close to the truth as we can. The truth is important, and that's what we're about here. So I appreciate that. Ken, any final words? We've got Michael here, such a nice guest and discussion. So Ken, you're going to be a fan favorite, my good man. I appreciate you doing this. It's not always easy. Listen, I'll say this, Ken. Okay. I get a lot of comments from the evolutionists a day. It's exhausting. And, I don't get into comment wars because that would be my full-time job. If I did comment wars, I wouldn't have, all these books written. So I like doing these. Pardon?
You wrote those?
Well, not all of them, but most of them. So this is the new Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook. So this is the newest one I wrote, and I was happy to see for 2-3 days it was #1 on the new release section on Amazon. So anybody interested, pick that up. It's available. It's worth it.
I'm kind of jealous, man. I've been trying to write my own book for a while.
We're going to get you one. Listen, work hard. When you get writer's block, and you just have to, for me, for the last few months, at least in terms of the writing phase, the research phase or the gathering of data phase, that's years. You know what I mean? For me, the right, like as in like just getting right to it, because I do this full time, pretty much wrote it midnights. I got 3 kids, so wife would go to bed, kids are in bed, I would start 8 hours straight writing, the years of research and data accumulation, put that into a narrative. So I want to encourage you and motivate you. If you're writing a book and that's something you want to do, that's kind of on your bucket list, just focus, get in there, shut the door, shut your phone off and get her done. Whatever I can do to help, Ken, that's awesome. What's the topic of your book?
It's not necessarily as like the books that you seem to write with like their scientific and all. It's more akin to like a Superman like story. Oh,
cool. Hey, when you release it, I'll be one of the first to buy it. So I like a good Superman story. Joshua Cousins. I hope I'm saying it right, brother. I appreciate your channel. I appreciate your support, Josh. He says, I bought all your books. Josh, he's putting my kids through college. So I appreciate it, my good man. I've got a few other books back here. Independent Origins Handbook, Refuting the Critic, Special Creation. So what I was saying there is I get a lot of evolutionists. They're kind of hostile. They're in the comment section. They're criticizing me. And Ken, I'm open here for a discussion. That's why we're doing this podcast series as well. And that's why it takes guts, Ken, to get in here and to have these discussions on the origins issue. So not everybody could do it, or else everybody would be doing it. So, kudos to you. That is awesome. And so, Ken, thank you for that. Thank you for engaging these important discussions.
Yeah. Before we go off, I have 2 things I want to say real fast before.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to put for anyone who wants to have a discussion with me, at any point in the future has any questions for me that weren't answered here, I will be putting my Discord in the comment section below when this video goes live. So if anyone wants to talk to me, they can. And real fast as well, because I can't seem to get a hold of it anymore. God Radio YouTube. If you watch this, I'm still open to talk to you. I don't know why you're not replying to any of what I have to say, but
Brett Keane.
Yeah, my Discord.
Brett Keane, yeah. So Brett Keane, if you're listening to this and you wanted a conversation with Ken, he's willing. So maybe Ken can reach out to you. I'll tell you what, Ken, in the comment section afterwards, or send it to me over text. I know we've been texting. Send me your Discord link, send me your channel link, whatever it is, and I can put it into the description box of the video, or we can put it as a comment in the comment section.
I'll just send it to you if you're willing to put it in the description. I feel like that's going to be easier to find, because then it can't get lost into the thing. And let's just let me just remind everyone to be nice in the comment section. Just because we have different ideas doesn't mean we have to be mean to each other.
Just because we have differing views and differing opinions doesn't mean we can't come together and have a civil, a respectful, and a sophisticated dialogue. So that's what it's all about. Okay, guys, we are now on to 2 hours here. I hope you enjoyed what is essentially the first episode of our Standing for Truth, Creation versus Evolution conversation podcast. So thank you for tuning in. And if you want to become a Standing for Truth patron and help us continue working full-time and putting out full-time content, Patreon is a great way to support us. You can also help us out with a one-time donation over standingfortruthministries.com. You click the donate page, and of course, we'd greatly appreciate it, because we want to put out the best content for you guys. And make sure you're subscribed, because in the event section, you can see we got a ton of great debates coming up for you guys. And we've got a few more that should be set either tonight or tomorrow. Last thing I'll say, we're back here tomorrow, 5 o'clock EST. Jay Siegert, we've got a presentation, Evolution, Probable or Problematic. Bring your questions. As usual, we are going to be doing these live. Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, all over Amazon. The ERV Handbook is available. So go click that link. You won't regret it. It's the most comprehensive book that you'll find on the topic. And I'm looking forward to the critics, because Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal put out some criticisms and I was disappointed. So those are going to be fun to address and decimate. So stay tuned. Okay. Again, Ken Rock, thank you for doing this. And to the audience, thanks for tuning in. Standing for Truth is out.